The Sum of Their Parts, written by Holdmybeer. Chapter 2. The three of them were accumulating a number of things they didn't want to become public knowledge, and they all knew they would eventually need a place to keep it. The plan had been simple. Grimmauld Place was already unplottable and had been under the Fidelius once, so they knew it could be done. They didn't know how to cast it, but they did know a way around it. A letter to Headmistress McGonagall got Hermione permission to visit Dumbledore's portrait to ask about it, because it was Hermione, and everyone familiar with her knew she wanted to know everything, and she returned long hours later with pages and pages of scribbled notes. "I got everything from Professor Dumbledore," Hermione greeted them. "We can cast it on the basement or the house. The bad news is that the Fidelius can't be layered. The magic considers the dual protection a sign of lack of trust in the Secret Keeper, and thus void. The spell is complicated and demands a lot of power, but it should be possible. Harry has the magic for it, and I know the ritual now." "We need a place to keep the dark things we didn't get rid of," Harry said. "We're going to need the space for later, too. Training, at the very least." He didn't voice what else they might need it for. None of them really wanted to think too much about what they might have to do in the months and years to come. "Basement, then," Ron said. "We can ward Grimmauld with everything we have, but if someone's looking for incriminating stuff, we're going to need a place to hide it. Most people don't know about the Fidelius in the first place, and it's not like we're at war anymore, is it?" Sure, Hermione asked the headmaster about it because she's Hermione and has to know. But it's not like we need to ward a house against Voldemort anymore. Hiding the house entirely would just make people suspicious. "Basement," Harry agreed. "It's big enough for the stuff we need to hide, and no one but us knows about it. We can find somewhere in the middle of nowhere to learn the more destructive spells." He hesitated. "I'll cast it. Who's the Secret Keeper?" Ron and Hermione looked at each other. Harry wondered if Fidelius would always be synonymous with betrayal to them too, or if he was the only one who would always hear Secret Keeper and remember Wormtail. "Hermione," Ron said grimly after their silent discussion. "She has problems with trusting authorities too much, but I have the bad temper. She holds the vow too. Realistically, if you can't trust her, you're going down anyway." It was solid reasoning. Based on Hermione's tight expression, she didn't appreciate it being put quite that way, however true it was, but she shook her head and ignored it. "The notes," she said instead, and gave him the papers. "Read it, memorize it, all of it." Harry didn't bother pointing out that there were at least a dozen pages. Hermione had written them. She knew exactly how long the ritual was. Then again, if he couldn't memorize a Fidelius charm, what chance did he have at some of the more esoteric things he had spotted in the Black Library? At least this piece of obscure magic didn't come with forced proximity to Severus Bloody Snape. There were 13 pages in total. Hermione had numbered them. He didn't know if the number was accidental or some deliberate, magically powerful number thing, but it did leave him with a lot of material to memorize. There were diagrams too, but most of it was Hermione's familiar handwriting, far more delicate and precise than he had ever managed. Every day they left that basement exposed was another day someone might stumble across one of the many dark artifacts they still had. Harry hadn't stepped on too many toes yet, but he had learned to expect the worst. Now that they had a solution, the inner drive to see it done was relentless. It took 3 days of hard work before he could recite and recreate everything to Hermione's satisfaction. The ritual itself took half an hour, not counting the 2 hours they had spent beforehand, setting it up and carving the runes, or the hour Hermione had spent checking and double-checking the setup and her calculations. It also left Harry swaying and pale from the sheer amount of magic it had demanded. He felt like he had run a marathon, like his lungs had expanded far beyond their size and his every muscle was burning. The half an hour of constant focus had been fine and was something he had become used to. The pull of magic as the ritual had reached its crescendo and the Fidelius had spun into being was something else entirely, and he understood now why Dumbledore had been the one to cast it originally. Ron pressed the invigoration draught into his hand, and Harry drank it gratefully. "You okay, mate?" Harry shuddered as the potion took hold and the room stopped spinning. "Yeah, just need a moment." The last of the fatigue vanished. Harry straightened and looked at his two friends. Did it work? It was the most peculiar feeling of knowing he had cast the Fidelius and having no idea of what he had cast it on, and he did not appreciate it in the least. Why had they cast it in the kitchen anyway? There was nothing worth a second look there. "The basement of Grimmauld Place is in the kitchen," Hermione spoke clearly, and the missing piece fell into place. The wall parted before their eyes as the secret settled. The door to the basement appeared once more, and Harry felt a rush of elation that had nothing to do with the potion in his blood. They had done it. They had bloody well done it. And if they had the skills and abilities to learn this, there was nothing stopping them from trying a dozen other useful spells from the Black Library that he had his sights set on. With the basement turned into a safe storage room for the more questionable items, Harry's attention drifted back to the goblins. None of them were willing to risk just walking into the bank, not with the way they had last left, and a letter to Gringotts has been almost gleefully clear that they, due to irregularities, would only be able to accept withdrawals in person. If that wasn't a trap, Harry didn't know what was. "So, hypothetically," he asked his great-aunt one morning, "if we robbed Gringotts during the war to get our hands on one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, threw around Imperios like candy, proceeded to escape on Dragon, and wrecked a good part of the building in the process, how should we handle our finances? I already wrote them, and they made it very clear that unless I show up in person, nothing is coming out of my vaults." Dorea smiled fondly at him. "That sounds like the Potter blood. He didn't have the temperament for the more subtle arts, my Charlus, but he was magnificent with destructive spells. Of course, that didn't help much in politics, but the threat was good to have." Not for the first time, Harry wondered about his family. The image he was slowly building was that of a skilled family, powerful and utterly ruthless, far from the image of the careless prankster he had been given of his father and the harmless muggle lover his grandfather was supposed to have been. But then, his parents had died young, not much older than Harry's current age. Who knew what his parents could have become if the prophecy hadn't put them all in Voldemort's path? "I'm not sure how well they'll respond to threats, though," Harry said dryly, "although I can cast a very good fiend fire." Dorea sniffed. "We will be dealing with another goblin rebellion soon enough. Utter lack of respect for their betters. Claim your vaults. By blood and law, don't let the miserly little beasts cheat you. They'll use every loophole they can, and transfer it elsewhere immediately. Make sure you claim any and all vaults as well as Regent of House Black. The Wizarding Bank of Constantinople is acceptable. Contact them and request a banker to be present at Gringotts to keep the little creatures from any funny business. Durmstrang swears by the dwarves, but they require far more effort than they're worth." She made it sound so easy. "I'm still not sure they're not going to kill me on sight." Dorea made a dismissive gesture. "They respect only power and gold. If you have both and prove willing to use it, there is little they can do once your wealth is out of their hands. If they demand compensation, demand the same in turn for their treason and collaboration with the impostor riddle. Do not yield. You are a Potter and a Black, victorious in battle against a Dark Lord, and you will act as such. If you flinch, they will bleed you dry. In essence, be an arrogant snob of a pure blood." Harry didn't like the thought in the least, but he also knew that was the way politics went, and he might as well get used to it. Power might be a problem. I can't draw my wand in Gringotts, and my name is either cursed or praised, depending on the day of the week. There was a hint of something deeply vicious in Dorea's sharp smile. "We will deal with the useless public later. In time you will learn a degree of wandless magic. Until then, you will draw your magic to you when you approach. They're sensitive to magic, goblins, and they know power when they see it. be a towering thunderstorm unto them and make them yield. Something gave Harry the distinct impression that his great-aunt didn't like goblins much. Possibly, just possibly, it was the glint of raw, black madness in her eyes. It should probably have worried him more than it did, but Doria Potter was family and she was on his side. That was more than he could say about just about anyone else he knew. More importantly, perhaps, Teddy Lupin was the Black Heir. If anyone would be on Harry's side in forcibly fixing society until said young heir was safe, it would be the woman who was both a Potter and a Black. Harry sent a nondescript barn owl to the Wizarding Bank of Constantinople the next day, asking how he would go about moving his vaults from Gringotts. In the interest of full disclosure, he added that getting the vaults from the goblins might very well prove a problem due to his strained relationship with them. 2 days later, he received a reply, a short letter expressing the bank's pleasure at his business, as well as a request for a suitable time for their representative to visit him in other to settle his Gringotts business. Harry, having much to demand his attention these days, but nothing rigidly scheduled, offered to be available at any time during the Thursday 2 days later, and, should the notice be too short, any day that might suit them. He wanted it done, and he wanted it done fast. Grimmauld Place was no longer under a Fidelius, and so there was nothing stopping him from sending the address along. It still bothered him a little that he couldn't layer another Fidelius on top of the one in the basement to cover the rest of the house. The Black Wards were strong and vicious, but Harry's sensible paranoia still wanted more. The responding letter promised a representative at his door by 10 o'clock. According to the imposing grandfather clock in Harry's study, the wards stirred with the arrival of a visitor that Thursday at 10 on the very 2nd. The banker sent by the Wizarding Bank of Constantinople was tall and thin and looked a little like a caricature of an undertaker. While Harry didn't recognize his heritage, he would wager all the gold in Gringotts that it wasn't fully human. Probably not vampire, since he was out in broad daylight, but that didn't narrow it down much. The Black Wards shuddered slightly as he stepped inside on Harry's invitation, but they did not consider him a threat, whatever he was. "Greetings, Mr. Potter," the man spoke. His voice was monotone, and his accent was slight but unnervingly strange. He also did not seem to know or care who or what Harry was, or about the many unwanted titles the British had stuck him with, which was one point in his favour. "I am your representative from the Wizarding Bank of Constantinople. The bank acknowledges the fickleness of the goblin race and sends appropriate representation for its client." Harry swallowed. He definitely wasn't asking about the man's heritage. He was not about to risk messing up relationships with another bank. But he made a note to read up on anything he could about his new bankers. Wizarding Bank obviously did not include just humans. "Thank you," he finally said, and gestured for the man to follow him to the study. "I appreciate it a lot. What should I call you?" "Representative shall do, Mr. Potter." "Representative," Harry repeated. "Thank you for coming." He closed the door behind them and gestured for his guest to take a seat, then settled down in the imposing chair behind the desk. "May I raise privacy wards?" Not that Grimmauld Place wasn't secure, but it was second nature to all of them by now. None of them trusted a privacy ward they hadn't raised themselves, or seen cast by someone they trusted implicitly. A sensible precaution. Harry took that as permission. The spells flowed easily, half of them unspoken and cast by will and experience alone. Privacy ensured, he took a deep breath. What is the bank's stance on criminal convictions in other countries? "The bank cares little for the politics of others. There is no treaty with the British ministry," the banker said in that disturbingly emotionless voice. "Should they sign one, there are several large vaults in Gringotts that we would very much wish to discuss." He made the last word sound somewhat ominous, even with his monotone delivery. Harry didn't want to ask any further, but suspected there were probably a few important people who had messed up abroad if the ministry didn't want to sign that treaty. That, or they were just their usual idiot selves. In any case, it worked in his favour. "Anything we discuss here is confidential?" Harry asked to be sure. "We are client and bank, Mr. Potter. Such dealings are sacrosanct." Harry hesitated and tried to find a good way to put things into words, then gave up and settled for the Gryffindor approach. "I'm about to make a number of enemies," he said bluntly. "I have made my godson, Teddy Lupin, the heir to the Black Name. He will inherit the vaults upon his Hogwarts graduation or my death, whichever comes first. I need that inheritance to be invested safely. I want his future to be protected whatever happens. What is the normal salary of your investment bankers?" 8% of annual net profits for vaults of the Black and Potter size." Harry nodded. "I will pay 15 for the investment of the Potter vaults. I need money to fight a war, and I need it fast. I don't care what you invest in or how risky it is, as long as it is profitable." "The bank shall see it done." Harry hesitated for a moment, then brought out a sealed scroll from his robe. "A copy of my will. I am unlikely to survive long enough to settle down with a family. In the event of my death, half of my gold beyond the Black Vaults will go to Teddy Lupin. Invest it safely as well. The rest will be split between a number of people of age to handle their own finances. Place it in a vault and leave the choice to them. The will is validated and witnessed by the office of Augustus Brookstanton here in London. They will handle my estate. The Ministry has no legal right to get involved, but they will likely try anyway." The representative accepted the scroll with a slight nod. "The bank shall ensure the legalities are kept." Harry sighed. "Thank you. About Gringotts, I've angered a number of goblins in the course of the war. We, 2 friends and myself, broke into a high-security vault for an item vitally important to the defeat of Voldemort and managed to escape. We are very likely to be met by armed guards when they see me." "The bank will manage. The bank will persevere," the man intoned. Harry desperately hoped he was right. Harry had spent a while in between waiting for the bank's replies to learn from his grandmother how to draw his magic to him. It was much like trying to build up magic and focus for a powerful spell and just not releasing it, and it took him little time to pick up the trick. It also served no real practical purpose but to try and intimidate others. But if that was what it took to make the goblins listen to him, then that was what he would do. Voldemort, Harry realized, had used it often enough it would explain some of his terrifying presence. He suspected that Dumbledore had used it on occasion too, if nothing else than to make people listen when he spoke. Harry's own newly taught abilities were nothing compared to those two, but he still saw the crowd in the alley shift uneasily and part as they passed. With a glamour on, most of the attention had been on the representative next to him, but now it shifted to Harry instead. He would probably have a headache by the time they were through the alley, from the constant focus demanded by the combined glamour and the pull of his magic. But that was what potions were for. He sped up towards the dubious safety of Gringotts, and some wizard or another scrambled out of the way with wide eyes. Harry frankly felt a little sick. Was this what it had been like for Dumbledore and Voldemort? Watching people scatter around them like sheep? The representative at his side made a low, rattling, inhuman sound that sounded somehow amused. Harry grit his teeth and told himself to get over it. This was just a cheap parlour trick, and if people were intimidated by that, they deserved to be scared. The immense doors of Gringotts came into view before them, complete with the usual guards just inside the building. Harry dropped his glamour a few steps from the building, as close as he dared use it, without drawing even more attention from the doubtlessly already unhappy goblins, and he felt the adrenaline buzz of impending battle settle in his blood. His magic sang, and with part of his focus freed up again, the storm-like pressure of power increased as he pulled it closer, like a cloak. The guards by the door shifted. One of them hissed something in their guttural language, but none of them made a move to approach him, and Harry strode into Gringotts with the unyielding defiance that had sent him up against Voldemort time and time again. This enemy was less dangerous, perhaps, if not by much, and held no small chance of death as well. After 7 years in the wizarding world, Harry was well used to it. They were met by an unfamiliar goblin before they were even halfway across the room. "Mr. Potter," the goblin bit out and made his name sound like an insult. Used to the acerbic moods of Snape, Harry just smiled, a sharp, unpleasant smile that did not reach his eyes. "Goblin, we have accounts to discuss." A heartbeat. Then Harry glanced pointedly around at the attention they had gathered. "In private." The goblin bared his teeth in an equally sharp and disturbingly pleased smile. "Yes, wizard, we do. You wish to bring your companion?" "My representative from the Wizarding Bank of Constantinople." Harry's smile turned decidedly vicious. They were very accommodating. The goblin's smile vanished, and the look he sent Harry's companion was full of loathing. "Follow me, wizard," he snarled. He did not pause to see if his two guests kept up, but led them straight into a maze of hallways and offices beyond an almost invisible door to the side of the room. For all that Harry was a good bit taller than the goblin, he still barely managed to keep up, and by the time they finally stopped, he was well and truly lost. He didn't doubt it was on purpose. The goblin led them into an office, followed by two guards that took up positions by on either side of the door. Harry settled into one of the uncomfortable chairs. The silent representative at his side did the same, and Harry could have sworn he saw the tall man somehow blur out of the corner of his eyes, like his shadow was out of sync with his body and was half a step behind him in settling down. Definitely not human. Harry was starting to suspect he didn't want to know what the non-human part was. No wonder the man did not seem at all concerned about walking into the heart of Gringotts with a human who was firmly on the bad side of the goblins. "We have been waiting for your arrival, human," the goblin said from his place behind the imposing desk. He seemed to relish every word. "Imagine that," Harry said blandly. The goblin did not offer his name. Harry did not care enough to ask. "I'm afraid it's going to be a terribly disappointing meeting for you, then. Transfer my vaults to Constantinople, goblin. All of them, by law and blood. Potter, Black, and anything else out there that might have been left to me in any of my positions, including that of Regent of the House of Black and Godfather of the Black Heir." It probably wasn't the wisest approach, but Harry couldn't bring himself to care. Sucking up to them obviously wouldn't do a thing to help, and he had not forgotten his grandmother's command. The goblins didn't seem to be affected by the heavy pressure of magic in the room, but that didn't mean they didn't just hide it well. Harry stretched deliberately, every bit the arrogant pure blood facing an inferior, and focused harder on the pull of magic. His fingertips tingled uncomfortably, and he felt the hairs on his arms stand on end, but it was worth it to see the goblin freeze. Harry gave him a mocking little smile. The goblin bared his teeth. For a moment, Harry wondered if he was about to get an axe in his back from one of the guards, and found himself remarkably indifferent to the idea. Then the goblin snarled, and Harry knew he had won the first round. "There is still compensation to discuss, wizard, for your casual destruction of one of the most important buildings to goblin-kind. Expensive compensation." "Of course," Harry agreed mildly. "As soon as we discuss compensation for your blatant treason and cooperation with Voldemort." "You can prove nothing, wizard," Harry shrugged. "I've got a number of incriminating memories and a very unhappy public looking for a scapegoat that says otherwise." Pure maliciousness glowed in the eyes of the goblin. "We can kill you before you ever leave this room." The guards by the door shifted ominously. The representative by Harry's side remained unmoving, seemingly not concerned. The threat would probably have a lot more effect on someone who had not gone willingly to his death, not 6 months prior. As it was, Harry just raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure that will go over well with the public," he said blandly. "They're just looking for someone to take out their anger on. Another goblin rebellion will be just the thing. I'll be dead, sure, but Gringotts will be a smouldering ruin, and goblins just a footnote in the book of extinct magical creatures. Sounds like a fair enough trade to me." For a long second, the office was utterly silent as Harry met the goblin's hateful glare without flinching. He didn't know if they had some goblin type of legilimency, and he didn't care all that much. All they would find was calm acceptance of his own potential death, as well as information they would have no way of revealing without letting on that they had a way to read minds, and, in turn, bring a paranoid wizarding world down upon them. Then the goblin snarled and his claws dug deep into the desk. "We will transfer the vaults. Step foot in Gringotts again, wizard, and you will be executed where you stand." "Excellent. Pleasure doing business with you, goblin," Harry said, just a little spitefully. He had half been expecting a goblin rebellion to break out. All in all, he figured it had gone surprisingly well. "I moved my vaults to the Wizarding Bank of Constantinople," Harry said when he saw his two friends again that afternoon in Grimmauld, after the paperwork was done and the representative had left. "Doria's portrait recommended them. They got the Black and Potter vaults out of Gringotts and me out of there alive. I recommend you do the same. We're not exactly welcome in Gringotts. I'd move the other Weasley vaults as well. It's just a matter of time before we have to deal with another rebellion." For a moment, neither of them reacted. Then Ron rubbed a hand across his face. "Bloody hell, I need a fire whiskey," he said, and "Harry James Potter!" Hermione hissed a moment later. "You went to Gringotts alone?" Harry shifted a little uneasy. Hermione Granger was not pleased. "I had a representative from the Bank of Constantinople with me. I don't think he was entirely human," he offered, not sure if this would help on her anger, but willing to give it a try. Hermione made a frustrated sound, and no, this wasn't good at all. It took a lot to get Hermione to a stage where she was reduced to sounds instead of words. "So did we just start a new goblin rebellion?" Ron asked, only half joking. "I don't think so," Harry said carefully. "I mean, I got out of there alive." "If they start a rebellion and blame it on you, you're dead, mate," Ron said, and this time there was no joking in his voice. "It's just a matter of whether it's the goblins or the wizarding public that get to you first." Harry sighed. "I know, and no, I'm pretty sure they would have started a rebellion while I was still there so they could target me, but we'll keep an eye on the Prophet to be sure. I can't enter Gringotts again, though. I'm dead if I do." "Oh, Harry." Hermione sounded a little disappointed, but mostly resigned. Harry just shrugged. There wasn't much he could say to it, and frankly, the fact that he had come out of it alive and unharmed was more than he had been hoping for. Hermione frowned slightly. The expression was familiar to both Harry and Ron as her thinking expression, and they both stayed quiet and let her work through whatever she was thinking about. "I don't have a lot in Gringotts," she finally said. "My trust fund is in a muggle bank, and I withdrew most of my galleons before we left." "Not worth the risk, then," Ron said quietly. "I'll let Mum and Dad know so they can get their galleons out. George, too, what with the shop and all. Bill hasn't returned to Gringotts yet, so he probably knows something's coming, but I'll tell him too. And I'll Neville and Luna," Harry finished, "just in case." There were probably others that should know, but those were the ones who had stood by him in the ministry. Those were the ones who had trusted him even then. He couldn't warn the world. No one would believe him, and he would probably trigger a new goblin rebellion just by doing so. Let everyone else manage for themselves. He had done more than enough for them already. Hermione took a steadying breath. "Well then, we have officially made an enemy of the goblin nation." It remained unspoken that there would be plenty of other enemies to come. The Tonks' home always felt silent and oppressive to Harry these days, even with a toddler in the house. The memories of the dead hung heavy in the air and made him feel like an intruder in a tomb. He still visited as often as he could to spend time with Teddy and do what he could to help Andromeda. This afternoon, Teddy had settled down for his nap, and Harry had settled down with a cup of tea with Andromeda. The silence around them had settled too, like a cloak of guilt that Harry couldn't shake. "I moved my vaults out of Gringotts," he finally said, when the silence and the unnerving loud sound of porcelain against porcelain became too much. "Sensible," Andromeda said quietly. "The dwarves?" "Constantinople," Harry replied. Doria, my great-aunt's portrait recommended them. I moved the black vaults, too, and left instructions to invest it safely. Teddy, whatever happens, Teddy will be taken care of, I swear." Andromeda nodded slightly. She never liked non-humans, she mused, and seemed a little lost in old memories. Constantinople, at least, employs some humans. A long way to travel to see your vaults, though. An unpleasantly long journey by port key. Harry shifted a little uneasily. Andromeda always made him feel like a child, even if she didn't intend to. I can apparate with a stop in Vienna. I don't like port keys much after... He trailed off. He seemed to do that a lot around Andromeda. Another slight nod of acknowledgement. An impressive distance. Do you have your license? Harry snorted. I didn't even have to take the class. The ministry handed them out like chocolate frog cards to any one of the graduating classes who could prove they had the ability after things had settled. I think they had other things to worry about. Another slight nod. I will see about moving my vaults to the dwarves, perhaps. They are not human, but they have not delved into the breeding experiments that Constantinople has. Harry swallowed and was forcefully reminded of the unnerving non-humanness of the representative they had sent. Breeding experiments? No one speaks of it, of course. I doubt any but the darkest of families dares imagine that they have done anything more than hire skilled part humans, which is hardly a crime. Vampires were too mundane for them, too well known, too many weaknesses. They imported lethifolds instead and bred them with unwanted magicals, thieves, murderers, mudbloods. We have a common ancestor who assisted them in the 1600s. They kept diluting the blood until they reached a useful stage. Harry took a large mouthful of tea to wash down the bile in his throat and felt it settle like lead in his stomach. Andromeda politely refilled his cup. How do you even breed a human with a lethifold? He asked, and instantly regretted the question. Magic is capable of incomprehensible wonders, Andromeda spoke softly, of equally dark and light. Harry stared at the delicate teacup in his hand and wondered if he would ever truly know the world he now belonged to. The trio had slowly fallen into a new routine. Ron and Hermione spent most mornings at the Burrow or handling whatever errands they had. Come noon they would head to Grimmauld. Sometimes they brought food, and sometimes Mute would cook for them. Then Hermione would bring out the familiar vials of Veritaserum and its antidote. Harry would be dosed twice, once after lunch and once more before Mute appeared with late afternoon tea, just to see if there was any difference in how he reacted to it, with a full and a mostly empty stomach. Some days he would be given the antidote after the first questioning, sometimes after the second, and the taste never got easier to handle. There was no difference depending on the time of day that he had noticed, and absolutely no progress. The effects were still as strong as the first dose, and remained so until they let the effects wear off or fed him the antidote. They kept up the questioning twice a day for a week, then stopped for a week before they began again. It was as close as Hermione was willing to cut it, and Harry didn't argue. Not after he had ended up with a pounding headache on the 7th day of the first week, as the toxins built up. They would study after lunch and more or less until it was time for Ron and Hermione to leave for the Burrow again. Sometimes it was books, sometimes it was wizarding laws, sometimes it was new spells, sometimes old spells cast faster or wordlessly or more accurately. Sometimes they just talked, surrounded by tea and snacks and a mountain of research materials in the library, sometimes light banter, sometimes nostalgic trips down memory lane, but over the months it had, with increasing frequency, become the time to discuss the heavier topics. On this particular afternoon, Harry brought out 2 official-looking scrolls and handed one to each of his friends. Brooke Stanton drew up the paperwork. All it needs is your signature, and you'll be members of the board of the Evans Lupin Foundation. Paid and everything. It's not charity, Ron. It's putting 2 people I trust implicitly in a position where they can make sure the money won't vanish into someone's pocket. I know your mum's been worried about what you plan to do. Hermione had already started reading. Ron simply stared at the scroll in his hand. You sure about this, mate? I don't know a thing about boards and legal things. But you know what it's like to have nothing. You've seen what people like Remus had to deal with. You know what it's like to see someone like Malfoy throw money at problems until they go away, while you're at the mercy of a legal system that's useless at best. You know if the people who apply are the kind of people we actually want to help. Ron opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Then, reluctantly, he started to read the scroll as well. "This is generous pay," Hermione said softly. "The job will be a headache, I've been told. The lawsuits are still being prepared, but one of the publishers has already agreed to a settlement instead of taking it to court," Harry said, quoting the most recent update he had received. "It might take a long time to get it all through the courts, but the compensations will be invested and keep the fund running. The profit is going to drag my name through the mud, I'm sure, but nothing new there. They'll likely try to do anything they can to discredit the Foundation, too." "Then you might want someone more experienced than us," Hermione warned. "There will be." Harry ran a hand through his hair restlessly. "There'll be experienced people, but there need to be others, too. People who know how it is, who get it, and won't judge the people they're supposed to help. We're aiming for 5 people in total, and 2 of those will work as solicitors, too. The compensations and investments will be able to fund it, not perpetually, but hopefully we shouldn't need that, just long enough to make a difference." "And what about you, mate?" Ron asked pointedly. "I can't be involved. It has to be completely out of my hands." Harry took a deep breath. "Sure, it's technically my money, but we've made sure it stops being mine the moment it hits those vaults. It's just a donation, nothing more. If I were on the board, someone might find a way to go after it anyway, but the risk is a lot less if I'm completely out of it." "Someone being the Ministry," Hermione stated. "People like Malfoy, too, and the publishers Harry's about to drag to court, and Merlin knows who else," Ron said. "Once Harry starts shaking things up, someone will go after him, savior who won or not. They did it to Dumbledore, too." Hermione made a frustrated sound. "It shouldn't be like this. We did our part. We fought battles that no child had any part in, all because the wizarding world was too busy hiding. We paid enough for peace. We shouldn't have to do this." Ron rubbed his face. "No, but who else is going to? The signed scrolls went to Brooke Stanton. The lawsuits carried on. Things settled a little, became a little more what passed for their new normal." Christmas came and went in an awkward, chaotic mess of uncomfortable silence, grief, and the overwhelming sense of loss where the dead should have been. Harry spent his time in the burrow along with the Weasleys and Hermione as they all tried to make the holidays as easy for everyone as they could. Andromeda and Teddy came over several times as well, and the toddler lit up the mood a little for everyone. The 3 of them stayed just as long as they had to, then fled to Grimmauld. The Black House was still dark and uncomfortable, but at least it was a change in scenery. They had the excuse of their NEWTs, at least. None of them had talked much about it, though Harry knew Hermione had studied and had probably nagged Ron into doing the same. The actual 2 days of examinations felt somewhat anticlimactic. There were few students, mostly homeschooled ones, and Harry easily ignored what attention he drew. All 3 of them took defense, charms, and transfiguration, if only for the sense of closure. Hermione added runes, arithmancy, and potions. There were several others she could undoubtedly have passed too, but she had just shrugged a little uncomfortably when Harry had asked. "It doesn't matter much anymore, does it?" she had finally said, in a voice that had sounded tired and resigned and bitter. "Special allowances would always have been made for us if we'd wanted a ministry career, and if I'd been a normal muggle-born and not a hero of Hogwarts, no amount of NEWTs would have seen me promoted to anything past assistant to some minor official, even after a lifetime of hard work. These are the classes that matter to me. What good would the rest of them do? Their grades were decent, Hermione's outstanding. That all 3 of them earned an outstanding in defense was to be expected as well. None of them cared all that much anymore, but at least it would get people off of their backs a little. The day before New Year, Hermione carefully placed a thick, ominous-looking book on the floor amongst half-empty teacups and piles of notes and picked up her wand. Harry knew it was going to be bad when she opened the conversation with a series of privacy wards that would put the ministries to shame. It was confirmed the moment she spoke. "Remember," she said with steadying breath and the quiet defiance that had put her in Gryffindor, "this is not the Dark Mark." Ron stared at the half-eaten biscuit in his hand, then put it down. "Couldn't you have waited until after we finished tea to spring that on us?" Hermione rolled her eyes, but her expression was a little fond. "Then it would be dinner, wouldn't it? You're never not hungry, Ron." Harry reached out to pick up the book. It was heavy and old, and something about it made him want to wipe his hands. It looked clean and well kept, but the magic felt vaguely slippery to him. Some of the books had soaked up the ambient magic like a sponge. They had been in the library for a long time and had been frequently used as well. This book was clearly one of them. The leathery cover and spine were blank, with only intricate patterns impressed into the surface, but he found the title on the first proper page. "Mind Magic?" he asked. "I found it a while back when I looked for occlumency and legilimency," Hermione explained. "It didn't have much about that, but there is a chapter on the imperious curse and," she swallowed, "a section on a magical connection through a mark, the details of which served as the eventual inspiration for the magic behind the dark mark." Ron stared, food forgotten. Harry wasn't entirely sure what to say at all, utterly speechless. Hermione took their silence as a chance to continue and explain the rest before an argument could start. Like the dark mark, this mark is focused on a physical marking. These days it would usually be a tattoo. The connection is in the magic bound in it, not the symbol, so they can be whatever motive and colour we want them to be. The mark enables a mental connection through thoughts and emotions with enough practice, and it can serve as an apparition marker. Shy of something like the Fidelius or strong apparition wards will always be able to apparate to each other. She visibly swallowed again. "Unlike the dark mark, no one is the master of the bond, and no one should be able to control the others. We won't be able to pull on each other's magic or cause each other pain." Ron opened his mouth, then closed it again when it seemed like he didn't quite know what to say. Harry tried to push aside the memories associated with the dark mark and look at it as impartially as he could. "All right. If we did do it, the vow should keep me from running roughshod over you, even if there's something the book conveniently left out," Harry said, running through the wording in his head. They had to think like Snape and Voldemort and Dumbledore to cover all the loopholes, and the potential abuse of the bond was thankfully covered by several clauses already. It was a little unnerving to have to think like a Dark Lord, but after years of visions he was uncomfortably familiar with it. "If it ties us that closely together, what happens if one of us die?" Hermione hesitated. "A lot of marked Death Eaters are still alive. The dark mark didn't kill them when Voldemort died. The theory should be the same with these. The loss would hit harder," she continued, "but it shouldn't kill." "And with the vow?" Harry pressed on mercilessly. He had to know. Even if it was just Hermione's best guess, it was a lot better than nothing. Hermione trailed off, and the pain in her eyes made Harry feel like he just tore out his heart. Then she squared her shoulders, Gryffindor to the end. "It would kill you, but it shouldn't touch us, and don't you dare, Harry James Potter, or I will bring you back and kill you myself." "Full name. Sucks to be you, mate," Ron stage whispered, but he looked a little paler than before as well. Harry didn't blame him. Hermione was talking about binding themselves to a Dark Lord in the making. He'd be more than a little worried in Ron's place. "You'd know, wouldn't you?" Harry stage whispered back. Then he sighed. "An apparition marker alone would be priceless, and not just for us. It sounds suspiciously useful for people like the Auras, too, even with the bad associations. Yet no one, not even the Order, has ever looked into it that we know of. What's the catch?" There was always a catch. 10 years with the Dursleys taught him that, and 7 years of Hogwarts assured him the wizarding world was no different. 10 years in Azkaban," Hermione said grimly. "It's soul magic. The dark mark itself isn't illegal. Malfoy always managed to block that, but casting it is. It didn't matter much compared to everything else Voldemort did, but it was still dark magic." Harry knew there and then that this was the moment when their plans went from technically legal ideas and could-bes to outright rebellion. So far, they had done nothing really wrong. They had researched some questionable things, complained and plotted and planned and practiced within the safety of the Black Wards, but they hadn't crossed that line yet. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, his eyes were every bit the colour of the killing curse, and every bit as unyielding. "I'll cast it," Mate, Ron started while Hermione chewed on her lower lip, and Harry raised a hand to stop the argument before they could start. If they find out, I might be able to stay out of Azkaban for now. Neither of the other two could claim the same. Hermione was a Muggle-born, and Ron's family didn't have the money for bribes. Harry hated his titles, hated the boy who lived or the man who won, or whatever they were calling him these days. But if this was what it took, those titles might as well be good for something. In a fair world, it shouldn't matter. But he wouldn't be doing this if the wizarding world was fair. Besides, he'd already cast 2 of the 3 Unforgivables and carried a soul fragment of a Dark Lord around for most of his life. He'd been researching and practicing questionable magic for months, and he was about to start a brand new career as a Dark Lord himself. If someone, somewhere was keeping score, he was probably damned already, and a bit more dark magic wouldn't make much of a difference. You think I'm going to let you bugger off to Azkaban alone? Hermione'll find a way to break us out. Hermione sighed. Honestly, Ron. She looked a little less worried, though. Of the 3 of them, they all knew Ron was the one with the most objections to the darker magic they researched. Harry stared at the book, then looked up to meet the eyes of his best friends. Are you sure about this? Hermione huffed. Would I have brought it up if I weren't? Honestly, Harry. Good point. Ron? Ron ran a hand through his thick hair and just rested it there for a moment. Then he made a tired sound. If you'd asked me a year ago, bloody hell no. Now? Ron looked up. No, I'm not sure, but we'll need everything we can get if we want to change this bloody mess of things, and we'll need the apparition marker. Yes, cast it. Merlin, damn it, we've already thrown our lot in with a saviour-turned-budding Dark Lord, and if this'll help what we're doing, then that's all I need. Harry swallowed against the lump in his throat. You don't have to. Neither of you do. Yeah, we do, because you're our best friend, mate, and we're not letting you do this alone. Gryffindors are supposed to be impulsive hotheads. We spent 7 years getting into trouble together. No reason to stop now. Harry gripped his hand tightly and Ron gripped it back like his life depended on it. They stayed like that for an endless second, then let go. Ron cleared his throat to hide his slight flush of embarrassment. So what's it going to look like then? And if you say a snake, I'm going to hex you, stupid. Borromean rings, Hermione said immediately. 3 linked rings where removing any one ring results in all of them being unlinked. Ron blinked. Blimey, you just thought of that? Hermione shifted, a little embarrassed as well. Once I found the spell, I tried to consider what we might use for it. It's a geometrically simple symbol, easy to draw, and unlike the triquetra, it doesn't have a number of meanings attached to it. It can pass for a simple Muggle tattoo, and it seemed appropriate. Somewhere not on our arms, though, Harry said, and noticed he wasn't the only one who deliberately didn't look where the dark mark had been on the arms of Voldemort's most trusted followers. The shoulder? Ron suggested. I mean, we could do the chest, but, He trailed off and flushed red before he could finish his gesture in the general direction of Hermione's chest. Harry and Hermione looked away at the same time, and while Hermione didn't blush the bright red only a Weasley could, Harry suspected that his own ears were getting there. Even months on the run together hadn't ruined the last of that awkwardness. He wondered if it were different when it was just the 2 of them alone at the burrow, but promptly pushed the thought aside again. He really didn't want to think about their relationship like that. Harry cleared his throat. Shoulders sounds good. It won't be noticeable. Right. Ron rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Colour. Black, Hermione said. I know it's the same colour as the dark mark, but let's keep it simple. It'll be just like another Muggle tattoo, nothing ominous in that. We went through a lot together and wanted something to symbolize our bond. Besides, with robes on, no one should see. Harry stared at the 2 of them, not quite able to wrap his mind around their willingness to bind themselves to him like that. Then he looked back at the book, resting innocently between them. Give me a day to learn the spell proper. The new year was welcomed by spectacular fireworks, and no place more so than in the wizarding-heavy areas. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes had sold their entire stock of fireworks shortly before Christmas, and had sold the excess they could produce as fast as they could get it packaged. The burrow was the centre of a whirlwind of colours and sound and light, of bright dragons fighting in the sky before exploding in a cascade of sparkles and rearing winged horses that took off in trails of multicoloured light and set off fireworks with every beat of their wings. When the celebrations had faded away and the guests at the burrow had started to retire, Harry, Ron and Hermione returned to Grimmauld. They greeted the early hours of 1999 in the library under heavy silencing spells and familiar privacy wards. No words were spoken. Harry wasn't going to insult them by asking if they were sure, and neither of them were going to let him. By silent agreement, Ron went first. None of them had touched a drop of alcohol or potions of any sort, wanting to make sure nothing went wrong. Ron took off his outer robe and shirt without a sound, then took a deep breath and knelt on the floor. He glanced at Harry and nodded, and Harry rested a hand above his right shoulder blade. He would cast the spell and thus be the focus for the bond. They would all be tied together, but the magic would go through him. The spell had no words. The book had been downright derogatory towards the idea of putting words unto such a sacred act of trust, but required an unnerving familiarity with soul magic. Harry was uncomfortably aware that if it hadn't been for his unwilling experience with Horcruxes and possession, he would have been unlikely to be able to cast it without far more practice. Harry closed his eyes and went through the spell, one wordless step at a time. He felt the magic gather between his palm and Ron's shoulder, felt his own body as a glowing entity next to Ron's distinctly different one, and in the knot of magic in his hand, the strange meld of the two of them. On a whim, he grabbed Hermione's hand in his free one, felt the brightness of her magic join their already melded one until it glowed like a small sun. And then he forced the magic down. Ron gasped and Harry's eyes snapped open. In an instant the mark was burned into his skin, and beyond it, beneath it, Harry saw the joined magic enter their friend's body like strands of light that entwined with Ron's own light and made Harry's faded scar burn with the familiar feeling of soul magic. Harry pulled back his hand as if burned, but the mark was already there, 3 flawless black circles, and then Hermione's other hand was gripping his, and he was somehow sitting down without any recollection of doing so. "Breathe," Hermione said, low and urgent, and Harry did so. One breath after another, slow and steady, until he could finally focus again. "Mate." Ron had turned to watch them, a worried look in his eyes. "Was it the spell?" "Yes. No." Harry wasn't sure what to answer and couldn't find the words for it. He finally tried anyway. "Soul magic. My scar hurt." Hermione looked deathly pale. She was casting a moment later a string of medical spells aimed at his head. Then reluctantly she lowered her wand again. "Nothing seems to be wrong." Harry shook his head. "It didn't feel like the Horcrux. I think it recognized the feeling of soul magic and reacted to it." "It could be," Ron said, a little uneasy. "Sometimes scars from dark spells will act up around other dark magic, Bill told me once." "The magic version of the stiff old knee that can tell when a storm's coming?" Harry asked. Ron didn't seem to get the reference, but Hermione nodded slowly. "Maybe," she said. "Should we—" She trailed off. Harry shook his head. "It was the surprise more than anything. It felt like being back in 5th year for a moment. The spell worked fine. I saw it settle into Ron's magic." Hermione pursed her lips. "We continue, then?" She hesitated for only a moment before she took off her own robes and blouse, leaving only her bra and trousers on, as she sat down on the floor. Harry carefully did not look and closed his eyes the moment he had placed his right hand on her shoulder and gripped Ron's hand with the other. The second time was much easier. The bond with Ron was already in place, and the magic responded eagerly. Their combined magic burned bright and seared into Hermione's body and soul in an instant. And this time, Harry didn't flinch from the sharp pain in his scar. Hermione winced when the magic sunk into her skin but didn't move, and Harry opened his eyes to look at the mark. It was identical to Ron's, and Hermione let out a slow breath when Ron nodded at her. Then Ron glanced at him. "Harry?" "Right." Harry considered the easiest way to do it, taking into account his experience with Ron and Hermione's marks. then settled on his knees between them. He felt exposed without his robe and shirt on, but it was nothing more than Ron and Hermione had already done. It was nothing they had not already seen in their year on the run. He hesitated, then reached over his shoulder as much as he could. His hand might not be in the exactly right location, but it would be far easier to create the mark with something to focus on. He didn't want to try without that focus unless he absolutely had to. Ron and Hermione's hands twined with his without him needing to ask, and for a moment that was all he focused on. 2 warm hands in his own, their joined heartbeats, and then he reached for his magic for the 3rd time. It was different but familiar, the joined magic from the 3 of them gathering beneath their hands, and then he pushed the magic into himself. For one blinding moment, all he could feel was the intense pain of the mark as it sunk into his shoulder and settled deep in his magic. Then the burn faded, and he released the breath he did not know he had kept in. Their hands parted, soft fingers brushed against his still tender shoulder. "It looks perfect," Hermione said, and the words had a strange echo in his mind. The magic, while painful, felt perfect now too, like it had been missing something that had clicked into place as the 3rd part of their bond joined. He felt different too. Not much, but it felt like there was more to him now than there had been before. 2 veiled parts of his awareness that he had never known before. Harry focused on those 2 new bits of not entirely him and pushed a thought towards the dual bonds. Did it work? The gasp from Hermione and the wide eyes from Ron was all the answer he needed. He was still greeted by wonder from Ron and a relieved feeling from Hermione. "Yes," she said, delighted and amazed and thrilled all at once. "Merlin, yes." Harry's first experience with Veritaserum after the mark was an unmitigated disaster. 3 drops of potion, one painfully familiar opening question, "What is your name?" And Harry was on the floor, throwing up until there was nothing left but bile. His frantic heartbeat was thunder to his ears, and he felt like someone had jammed a knife into his brain and twisted. He was distantly aware of hands on his shoulders and a drop of sour bitterness on his tongue as someone held his head back, and then, faintly, a man's voice speaking words he should probably know. Harry! A litany of spells, somewhere in panicked female voice and magic against his skin, followed. "There's nothing wrong with him according to this. Harry! Something cleared in his mind, slow and sluggish like molasses. He opened his eyes carefully, had he closed them, and groaned. The light was painfully bright, and everything was too clear and the colours too vivid. "Head hurts," he rasped. "It happened." "Harry!" Hermione's voice was quieter this time. "Merlin, Harry, you scared a decade off of us." A damp cloth appeared in his field of vision, held in a rough hand. Harry pressed it against his forehead and clung to the blissful coolness like a lifeline. A small bottle appeared as well, and Harry swallowed the potion without question. It tasted like a headache reliever. Things started to ease, the pain faded, the light became bearable. "Harry?" Ron asked. "The mark," Harry said hoarsely. His throat felt like he had been screaming. "When Hermione asked my name, the magic was confused. I'm Harry, but part of the mark is Ron Weasley. Part of the mark is Hermione Granger. And the magic is new and hadn't had time to settle." Hermione finished and bit her lip. "Harry!" He already knew what she was about to say. "No, I'll give the magic time to settle," he hurried before she could argue. "But I have to learn. At least it's different. Maybe this is the break we've been looking for." Hermione didn't look convinced. Harry couldn't blame her. He didn't feel particularly convinced either. 2 days later, after giving the new marks time to settle, Harry cast the Fidelius for the 2nd time. They had searched for a suitable location to practice the more questionable and destructive spells they had found, and had eventually settled for an uninhabited island of Orkney. Its main qualifications to Harry's mind was that it was decently far away from other humans and had very little that might attract tourists. Grimmauld Place was too risky a place to cast some of the spells he wanted, and the island was within apparition range, if barely, in Ron and Hermione's case. If it came to it, there were plenty of places they could use to break the trip in 2. They all had lots of experience with the English countryside. The weather was no worse than they were used to at Hogwarts, really, and they had magic to keep them warm and dry. The area they had picked, a nice, reasonably flat section of mostly grass, took most of the day to ward proper. Muggle-repelling charms, followed by the usual defences, and then several hours of setting up the Fidelius. By the time they were ready for the final part of it, the sun had long since set, and all three of them were getting tired. "Sure you're up for it, mate?" Harry glanced at Ron. "Better than having to come back tomorrow and have to redo the setup. Got the potions?" Ron lifted a small bag, and Harry sighed. "All right, let's do this." Hermione looked like she wanted to argue, then she shook her head, very familiar with Harry's particular brand of stubbornness. Raising the Fidelius was easier now that he had tried it before, but the amount of magic it took was enough to leave him dizzy. The surge as the Fidelius settled over the empty land was far more than what the basement in Grimmauld had demanded. The requirements definitely depended on the size of the area, Harry thought distantly, and maybe, just maybe, they had been a little too ambitious in the scale of things. A potion bottle touched his lips, and he drank without thinking. A flush of energy followed and made the world sharpen, and when the second bottle appeared, he reached out to hold it himself. It tasted like a headache potion and quickly eased the heavy throbbing behind his eyes. "Thanks, mate." "Better." Harry nodded in agreement, and Ron grinned. "Let's give it a look, then. Harry's hideaway is on the island of Farah." Watching the grassy island somehow seem to stretch like a piece of elastic to make room for another bit of land was decidedly surreal. This, however, was not what got Hermione's attention. "Harry's hideaway," she demanded. "Secret keeper makes the secret, that's the rule," Ron said cheerfully. "Harry's hideaway," Hermione repeated. Harry just laughed. It was mid-January when Harry got around to handling something he'd been procrastinating about. He had tried to find the best approach to it, and in the end decided that there was no easy way around it. Thus he found himself in Diagon Alley on a dreary Saturday, a heavy piece of parchment in his pocket, and on the hunt for George Weasley. His target was not behind the counter at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Lee was manning it, looking rather tired, perhaps from the crowds, but Harry suspected it was due to another reason, especially since Lee lit up a little at the sight of him and waved him through to the back rooms with a grateful look. The employees-only sign winked at Harry before the door opened to the Tway to George and Lee's workroom. Harry mentally corrected himself. George Weasley was bent over the table, a monocle in front of one eye as he examined something. He glanced over at the sound of the door, then put down both the small, mechanical-looking something in one hand and the monocle in the other. "Harry?" Harry drew his wand carefully to avoid startling a fellow twitchy war veteran and cast the usual, well-practiced privacy wards that all three of them had down to an art. Privacy ensured, he sat down in one of the few chairs in the shop that weren't somehow jinxed, hexed, or cursed, and put the folded piece of parchment on the table between them. "This is an offer for you to buy back my share of the shop for the original loan. No interests. It has to include the loan to make sure it's completely covered legally, but that's it," Harry said softly. "If you want it, it's yours." George's expression had turned from bewildered to lost, hurt, and a little betrayed, and Harry felt his heart clench at the expression. "Harry?" he repeated, and this time there was a tremble in his voice. "I know. Hear me out," Harry pleaded. "This is Fred's legacy. This is your shop, the two of you. Lee's here now and Angelina, but this was your idea. Sooner or later I'm going to make myself pretty unpopular. I don't want the shop to suffer for it if anyone finds out I'm a partner." George's eyes narrowed. "Do Hermione and Ron know about this?" The shop and the offer, no," Harry admitted. "The rest, yes." He had been careful to block it from them, and none of them could intrude uninvited. The bond was not that strong. George twirled his wand between two fingers for a moment, then added an additional privacy ward on top of Harry's. "Talk. This summer, when they started to talk about stricter rules for non-humans, we managed to convince the Wizengamot to leave the werewolves alone and keep Teddy safe. But what's next? Vampires, Velas, part humans. Is it going to target Fleur or Hagrid next time? Lucius Malfoy is worming his way back into power. Muggle-borns are still discriminated against, and some idiots are starting to talk about the poor, innocent Death Eaters being led astray by the half-blood Tom Riddle, and that the impure magicals out there are the real problem. George was silent. Harry took a deep breath. This isn't what we fought for. This isn't what Fred and Remus and Tonks and Dumbledore and all the others died for, and if no one else is going to do something about it, we will. That sounds suspiciously like a revolution, George said with deceptive mildness. It probably is. Harry hesitated before he raised his head in a silent challenge and continued. The only people that seem to get any changes done are Dark Lords. Bad changes, but changes. Even Dumbledore couldn't get much through the old windbags in the Wizengamot. If that's what it takes to stop another blood war, then that's what we'll do. Silence settled. George watched him for a long moment. Then he raised his wand and turned the parchment into ash with a swift incendio. I want in, he said, for once deadly serious. I want even. And the conspiracy gained another member. Winter carried on. It wasn't a particularly harsh one, but it was wet and dreary, if unusually mild. Snow would probably have improved the appearance of Grimmauld and made it at least a little nicer to look at, but rain did not, and the backyard looked damp and miserable whenever Harry glanced outside. He also found himself busy patching up the issues with Grimmauld that had appeared with the colder, windier months, and he had roped Ron into helping him. With 2/3 of their trio busy with Grimmauld and Hermione in need of potions ingredients and several books, she had gone to Diagon Alley with Neville as company. The returned 7th-year students had been given an additional measure of freedom on account of their age and had been allowed to leave over the weekends as long as their schoolwork didn't suffer. Neville, being a prefect, needed his occasional breaks and had gladly agreed to accompany Hermione. Harry had too much to do to come along and had reluctantly admitted that between the two of them they should be pretty safe. Instead, he had sent her a fond thought and hopes for bearable crowds and continued his lessons in wizarding house repairs with Ron. He regretted it 2 hours later when Hermione's sharp mental presence cut through his mind. Death Eaters in Diagon, 6 to my count, low-level fighters, no competent leader. They cast an anti-apparition and anti-disapparition jinx, but nothing else. Harry had pinpointed her presence before she finished the thought. The wards in Grimmauld had all 3 of them keyed in, and if they hadn't, he would gladly have torn them down and redone them later. On our way, Ron spoke for both of them, trusting Hermione and Neville to stay safe, but not about to let them face it alone. Harry spun on his heel, followed the mark that led to Hermione, and was gone. The Black Wards yielded to him, and he was not about to let some useless Death Eater stop him from getting to his friends. He tore through the hastily cast anti-apparition jinx on Diagon Alley with all the care and finesse of an enraged horntail, and landed at Hermione's side in the shockwave of the collapsed spell. A particularly vicious burst of magic took care of the anti-disapparition jinx as well. Ron was there a heartbeat later, wand in hand. Figured I'd let you go first and deal with the apparition thing. I punched through it, Harry told Ron when he had got his bearings. The junk shop, almost as far from the leaky cauldron and the most likely arrival point for the auras as they could get. Tore the other one down too. Probably put a bit more power in it than I needed. Not like they wouldn't notice when the spells came down anyway. Hermione? We're fine, Hermione said quickly. The first sounds of apparition could be heard outside, in between shouts and spell fire. The shop they were in was utterly empty, and Hermione didn't need to hear the question spoken. The owner fled as soon as trouble started, I think by flu. Merlin forbid he tries to help anyone else to safety. Hermione sounded disgusted, but Harry wasn't surprised. Then again, his opinion of the average British wizard and witch was a lot more pessimistic than Hermione's, too. Any idea of what their goal is? Ron asked. Neville shook his head. Avenging their dead master didn't look too organized to me. Chaos. Then, kill a few Muggle-born customers, maybe, although Harry had no clue how they would tell the difference. Maybe they were just out to make the world somehow pay for their master's defeat. They had all been keeping an eye on the door as they talked, but even then they only got a second of warning. Dark figures appeared just beyond the shop windows, distorted by ancient glass, and then the door exploded in a hail of splinters and shards. 4 Protagos snapped into place before the shrapnel could reach them, and Harry sent a cutting curse at the first of the masked figures an instant later. There was blood and a gurgling scream that cut off brutally, but before Harry could cast again, the second Death Eater had collapsed right inside the shop, taken down by a trio of stunners from Hermione, Ron and Neville. Wands at the ready and keeping a careful eye on the empty street outside, the 4 of them approached the 2 bodies. The first Death Eater had been killed pretty much instantly. Harry's cutting curse had been aimed at the man's throat and hadn't missed. The curse had cut deep and left the man almost decapitated. Hermione and Neville looked a little pale at the sight, but no one spoke. The Death Eater that had taken the trio of stunners was comatose but still alive. Hermione added an incarcerus on top, just to be sure. Further up the road were the first sounds of auras arriving, conveniently late as usual, but in that one moment there were no witnesses but the 4 of them. Ron and Harry glanced at each other, reached the same conclusion in that same instant, and turned to Hermione. "We have Veritaserum in the basement at Grimmauld," Harry said. "We need the information," Ron added. Hermione pursed her lips. All right, go!" Ron grabbed the still-breathing Death Eater and was gone in the sharp crack of apparition, leaving Harry and Hermione to face Neville. In that moment, it wasn't their slightly clumsy friend and classmate they faced, but the man who had been the potential bane of Voldemort. "I trust there will be explanations later?" Neville asked in a mild voice that was betrayed by his narrow-eyed expression. "Yes," Harry said, and didn't even consider lying. "Grimmauld Place as soon as we get out of here." Neville nodded. If he had any opinions about their strange behaviour, he did not let them show. It took long hours before they could finally meet up again. They had to give their carefully coordinated statements again and again, and had to wait around for hours in the unlikely case they were somehow needed, but finally, mercifully, the aura in charge let them leave. There was nothing else they could do. Harry had clearly acted in defense of himself and his friends, and the dead wizard had been a marked follower of Voldemort. It was as clear-cut as it could be. Mute met them at Grimmauld with tea and biscuits and vanished again before anyone could speak, and Harry sank into a soft chair with a tired sigh. Ron had gone to the burrow to reassure his family after leaving their captive in a cell, but he had let them know he would be along shortly now that they had finally escaped the questioning. Harry was grateful. He did not want to face that sort of conversation without both of his closest friends there. Neville took a slow sip of tea, then another as the uncomfortable silence stretched on. There was a soft crack of apparition in the entrance hall, and a moment later Ron appeared. "Sorry, took a while to convince Mum that we were all fine. She sent snacks, though." He put a large pack of sandwiches on the table and grabbed one for himself before he settled gracelessly in the couch. In the face of Molly Weasley's cooking, even explanations could wait a little. The sandwiches, enough to feed a minor army, were divided, and the silence of Grimmauld was broken by a small recreation of lunch at Gryffindor table. Eventually, even the mountain of food was gone. The tea had gone cold and been replaced. Hermione shifted uneasily. "Is this going to be a repeat of the end of our first year?" Neville asked mildly. "I get the strangest impression you've all done something incredibly reckless again." The man had come a long way from the clumsy boy who had stood up to them that night in the Gryffindor common room. He was the potential other child of prophecy, a hero of Hogwarts, and Harry wondered, unbidden, if he was looking at his own future downfall. That prophecy had been fulfilled, but they could be finicky things. And who was to say there wasn't another one out there, among the countless shelves in the Hall of Prophecy? "Mute!" Harry called. "Would you bring me the copy of the vow I keep in my desk?" He had the parchment in his hand before he could finish the sentence. Mute, as always, was gone again before he could thank her. By mutual silent agreement, it seemed like he had been elected spokesperson. Considering that it had been his idea in the first place, he kind of deserved it. "This isn't the society we fought for," Harry said bluntly. "No one's changed a damn thing even after 2 blood wars in as many decades. The Wizengamot is useless, and most people in the Ministry are too busy taking bribes and not paying attention to get anything done." Ignoring their goals and policies for a moment, Dumbledore tried to change society with politics and failed. Voldemort almost succeeded until he managed to bounce a killing curse off of me. Grindelwald almost succeeded too. If he didn't still have a weak spot for Dumbledore, it's doubtful he would have lost their duel. Seems to me like the only way to get a bloody thing done around here is to be a Dark Lord, and if I have to pin the Potter name next to Grindelwald in the history books to keep Teddy from growing up in this mess, then that's what I'll do. "The Dark Lord Potter!" Neville's voice was calm and even, and he seemed willing to at least hear them out. Then again, Harry had just seen the man take out Death Eater rejects with that same calm air about him. Harry handed over the parchment. "We have contingency plans. Wouldn't be a reluctantly Hermione-approved plan if we didn't. But yes, I'm not out to target innocents. I don't want all-out war, but if I'm going to make myself unpopular and stomp on most of the Ministry laws, and I will make no mistake, then I'll do so in my own name." The sound of parchment being unfolded was the only thing to interrupt the silence that followed. Harry watched as Neville's gaze quickly went through the wording of the vow once, then slower on his second read-through. Finally, the man looked up again. This vow could probably have kept Voldemort leashed. Neville did not stumble over the name, but he did stare at Harry like he was really seeing him for the first time. It was a vaguely unsettling feeling when the person doing so had taken on Voldemort himself, with nothing but a sword and a burning hat. "That's what we were going for," Harry agreed when it became clear that his 2 bondmates still weren't going to speak. "I'm still me, Nev. I haven't gone mental from the battle. I'm not about to take over where Voldemort left off. I'm still me, and if I ever cross the line, Hermione can stop me with a word." Permanently, if necessary, he did not add. There might have been a loophole somewhere they missed, but Harry doubted it. They had been exceptionally thorough in the wording. Neville nodded slowly. Harry did not speak, but allowed their former classmate and hopefully still friend to think through everything. "You've been busy while the rest of us have been at Hogwarts." This time the words were aimed at all 3 of them. They exchanged a glance, and by silent agreement chose Hermione as their spokesperson. "We don't really belong at Hogwarts anymore," she said softly. "We considered it, but most of the students have nightmares, even the first years," Neville confided, just as softly. "Nobody says it out loud, but we've all spent a lot of nights comforting the younger years. The prefects can't do it alone. The teachers have enough to deal with in the reconstruction of the school. The worst got repaired over the summer, but there's still a lot to be done, and they can't deal with hundreds of students with these kinds of issues." The story was painfully familiar to all 3 of them. Hermione and Ron in the burrow at least had some comfort together, but the mental bond had left all 3 of them all too aware of each other's nightmares. They had spent the night in Grimmauld Place at times, but that was mostly for a change in nightmares. Physical closeness seemed to keep some nightmares at bay, but the old house brought its own bad memories with it. Bill Weasley warded the burrow with everything he could legally cast under the current laws. Ron and I still sleep with proximity alerts and expect an attack when someone moves around at night. Mute is under orders to never pop into Harry's room for whatever reason while he is asleep. Even under the Black Wards, his first instinct is to attack, and he is perfectly capable of casting a reducto in his sleep. Hermione sighed. "I wanted my last year at Hogwarts. The truth is that we're all a danger to our surroundings." Neville nodded. "We've all got plenty of practice with our reparos. Even some of the second years can cast it now. The bathroom door in Ginny's dorm had to be entirely replaced last month." Ron winced. They could all imagine how powerful a spell had to be to make a solid door a lost cause to repair. "One of her dorm mates had a breakdown in there, and the locking spells she used took too long to dismantle," Neville explained before they could ask. "It turned out to be the anniversary of her younger sister's death. She died in Azkaban." Neville took a slow breath and pinned Harry with an unrelenting stare. "If you start another blood war, I will take you down. Pure blood or muggle-born side, it doesn't matter. Even the man who won is not invincible. I don't care if it kills me. I refuse to let another generation of children grow up without their families." Neville's voice was perfectly calm, perfectly accepting, and all the more grim for it. Harry nodded. "Only if Hermione or my own magic doesn't get to me first." That uncomfortable silence settled again as Neville watched them. Then the man sighed. "This is an incredibly stupid idea even for you, but what do you need? You've got an in at Hogwarts for another half a year in me. This is a stupid idea, and it's probably going to blow up spectacularly in our faces. But you have a point that politics won't do any good with the Wizengamot and the old pure-blood guard in the way. What do you need?" "You don't have to do this, Neville," Hermione said quietly. "We're grateful for any help, but you don't have to do this." Neville gave them a long-suffering look. "Yes, I do. It's a Harry Potter plan, Hermione. Merlin knows he's the only one insane enough to get that idea in the first place. You'll need all the help you can get." Ron snickered. Harry just looked a little betrayed, but really there wasn't much he could say to argue against it, and he knew it too. Afterwards, with Neville out of the house with promises that they would contact him if there was anything he could do, Hermione sat silently and stared at the parchment with the vow. Harry and Ron glanced at each other, then Harry gestured towards her and arched an eyebrow. Ron shrugged and turned to her. "Hermione," they had both learned it was safer to ask out loud than try to mentally interrupt her thought processes. "We need a way to keep this safe if we keep picking up more people. I trust George and Neville, but there will be others. Eventually we will make a mistake. Dark Lords have followers, allies, whatever we want to call them, and someone will try to slip in spies amongst them. Someone will change their minds and decide to work against us. Someone will decide we have gone too far and go to the DMLE with what they know. Eventually we'll be out in the open, and it won't matter. But until then..." "Even the dark mark and frequent legilimency attacks didn't stop Snape from working against Voldemort," Harry said and shuddered. "Something like the DA contract, maybe? I don't want forced loyalty. I just want to keep this safe. If people want to join later, we can figure out what to do then. This is just for secrecy. I've seen enough dark marks for a lifetime, and if I never have to use legilimency on a friend, it'll be too soon." "Our tattoos are technically related to the dark mark," Hermione pointed out. "Far enough removed that I can live with it, but it doesn't mean I want more people running around in my head." Ron made a face, and it gives the wrong impression. Everyone would see it as a brand like Voldemort's. A contract is better. Everyone knows what they're getting into, and no one can claim we changed the terms later. Someone doesn't want to sign it. That's what Obliviate is for. Hermione flinched almost imperceptibly, but they knew each other well enough to pick up on the small things. Ron closed his hand over hers and squeezed it in a silent apology. She took a shuddering breath, then seemed to focus herself again. "I'll make a first draft," she said. "Some of the black books I used for the vow had a number of ways to make a contract far stronger than the DA one was. Some of them could protect against mind magic as well. We don't want to enslave anyone, but we need to keep this safe until we're ready to have it made public. It needs to be ironclad. What should the penalties be?" "Death." Ron's voice was grim. Hermione looked like she was about to argue, especially after seeing the mostly decapitated Death Eater earlier, but Ron carried on before she could. "No, Hermione. When this comes out, Harry's facing Azkaban or the Vale. All three of us are. Even if he's done nothing yet, even if it's in name only, just calling himself a Dark Lord would be enough to condemn him. If it gets out before we're ready to defend ourselves, that's the end of it. The penalty for breaking the contract has to be bad enough that no one will try. We're not talking about forcing random people to sign up. Everyone will know what they're signing and what it means. I don't like it any more than you do, but either it's death or curses bad enough to make anyone think twice, and none of us want to do that." Hermione was silent. Harry stared at the book in front of him, an old, worn copy from the library that dealt with human anatomy and clearly didn't have healing in mind. He didn't like this, didn't like any of this, but a part of him had known it would come to this, even if he hadn't been willing to acknowledge it. If it had just been him, it would have been different. But he had got his two best friends tangled up in the whole mess too, and he needed to protect them. They were there because of him, because of his insane ideas, and he would do anything to keep them safe. He owed them that. I agree, he said softly. Swift, painless death if possible. Don't put in a clause about losing their magic either. Death is enough of a deterrent. It'll make the contract easier to accept too. We need to protect ourselves, but we're not Voldemort. We don't torture or kill for sport, and we're honest about the conditions. Hermione glanced between them, then at the parchment in her hand, hidden beneath Ron's larger one. I'll write it up, she finally said, and then we'll rewrite it until we're sure it's as safe as can be for all of us. Harry closed his eyes. Thank you. They still had a Death Eater to deal with in the dungeon. None of them wanted him there for any longer than absolutely necessary, but they still waited several days to be sure that someone wouldn't show up to question Harry further about the raid on Diagon Alley. Nobody seemed to care much about Hermione beyond her initial testimony, but the chance to speak further with the man who conquered, and to a lesser degree Neville, was apparently not something they were going to turn down. On the third day, Ron went to visit George at the shop in Diagon Alley and happened to invite him over to Grimmauld for some decent lunch away from the pressure of the burrow, like the concerned brother he was. George whined and dragged his feet about leaving his current project, but eventually came along, like the caring brother he was as well. George had been keyed into the wards on Grimmauld, and they appeared in the hallway together with the sharp crack of apparition. Harry and Hermione met them there, their expressions as grim and serious as Ron and George's had become the moment they were safe under the privacy of the wards. We have a Death Eater from the Diagon raid in the dungeons and Veritaserum to make him talk, Harry stated, not bothering with niceties. George's expression grew sharper, with a hint of the hardness he had never shown when Fred had been alive. I want in. They targeted our shop. Their shop, and a dozen others, but that didn't matter now. The Weasleys' wizard wheezes had definitely been a priority target, and only the heavy protections on the shop had kept it safe. I thought so. Harry glanced at Ron. Ron's staying up here in case something happens, and to give us advance warning if someone shows up. Hermione's got experience with Veritaserum. She'll handle that part. The old George and Fred would have asked, would have joked, would have demanded the story about the know-it-all bookworm having practical training with Veritaserum, or even what they meant about dungeons. This George only nodded once, sharply, and accepted it. Where is he? Hermione gestured for him to follow. Ron nodded once and gave them an unspoken good luck, then vanished into the nearest sitting room, while George followed Hermione and Harry into the kitchen. Hermione took a slow breath. The basement of Grimmauld Place is in the kitchen, she spoke clearly. As Harry watched, George's eyes widened as the secret sunk in, and the Fidelius lifted to reveal the hidden door before them. Bloody hell, he breathed. We found it after we destroyed Wahlberger's portrait, Harry said softly. We think the enchantments were tied into her. George just nodded slowly and followed as they descended into the darkness. The basement was much cleaner and lighter than it had been, but it was still clearly the remnant of a century or more of dark magic and all that came with it. The climb into the dungeons was the worst of it, dark and unnerving, even with the few steps it took, and the sight that greeted them was little better. They had ensured the man had food and water, and they had cast a Scourgify once a day. But the cells were claustrophobic at best, and the restraints were melted into the walls and gave very little yield. 3 days chained to a wall, with only the company of Merlin knew what that lived. The shadows had left dark circles under his eyes and a haunted look on his face. He was under the strongest silencing charm they had been able to find, and Harry only released it once the man was safely tied to a conjured chair against the wall and dosed with 3 drops of Veritaserum. None of them wanted to listen to whatever else the man had to say. Outside the cell, an enchanted quill wrote down every word and sound of what was about to happen, so they would be able to go over it again later. The man's expression grew slack and emotionless, and he stopped struggling. Only then did Hermione speak. "What is your name?" she asked clearly. Harry closed his eyes for a long moment as countless memories of that same voice questioning him flickered through his mind, always starting with that one same endless question, and then the Death Eater spoke. Diocletian Blishwick. The bond with Hermione trembled slightly. They didn't know who he was, hadn't even heard of his family, but she clearly felt the memories of Harry's interrogations/training sessions as vividly as he himself did. Harry had never been restrained, but the question was the same, the emotionless tone was the same, and for a moment it had been Harry there in Blishwick's place. Hermione took a deep breath to steady herself. "Did you willingly and without coercion join the Dark Lord Voldemort?" Yes, there was no doubt then. They had seen his dark mark. He had been part of the raid, and by his own admission, he had done so freely and willingly. There had been no one holding a wand to his family, no one threatening torture and death if he refused. Just another Death Eater like 100 others. Now they needed to find out just what he had done in his master's name. "Have you ever committed any crimes?" Blishwick stared unseeingly at empty air. "No." His voice was flat and monotone, his body language every bit what someone under Veritaserum should be, and they would know, having seen Harry under it 50 times or more already. But the answer didn't match with what they knew. Then the nut dropped. "Voldemort's ministry made the unforgivable curses legal," Harry said softly. "They wouldn't have been a crime." "Same with hunting muggles and cursing muggle-borns," George agreed, his focus on the chained Death Eater. "The scum probably still thinks the sun shines out his dead scaly arse. How many muggles have you killed, Death Eater?" "I am unsure." Blishwick seemed to blink slowly. "My lord let us hunt them freely in our raids. I crucioed a male to death before his family. I raped a pair of females and burned their hovel afterwards. I cast Reducto on a child when—" "Stop!" Hermione's voice cut through the toneless list of crimes. Blishwick fell silent. Hermione clenched her hands. The quill was still scribbling away on the parchment on the table. She looked pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke again. "Have you killed or harmed any muggle-born, half-blood or pure-blood?" "I killed a mud-blood beggar. He attempted to steal my wand. My lord only permitted his pure-blood followers to go after the half-bloods and blood traitors." "Oh, that's rich, Death Eater. You're a mudblood yourself?" George demanded. "My blood is impure. If a Veritaserum victim could sound ashamed, Blishwick did. My father was a mudblood. My Lord Gracious took pity on my flaws and allowed me to seek greatness by his side." The room fell silent. Blishwick didn't move. By Harry's estimate, they still had at least another half an hour worth of Veritaserum in the man. George glanced at him with a grim expression, then at Hermione in a silent question. He'd seen the same thing that Harry had then. Harry cast a quick muffliato, then turned to the one friend he trusted to be his conscience. "Hermione," he said quietly, "you should go keep Ron company." Hermione's attention turned to him with the speed of a snitch. "Harry!" "You already know he's guilty," George agreed grimly. "Death Eater scum of the worst kind. You don't need to know the details. We'll question him, get what information we can, get it written down. But you don't have to listen to this." Hermione's eyes narrowed. "We need to—" "Need to what?" Harry asked. "Hand over the evidence and incriminate ourselves? Veritaserum isn't trusted in court. There are no witnesses. Any good solicitor could probably get him cleared of most charges without solid evidence to send him to Azkaban. And he's not one of the infamous Inner Circle." Hermione hesitated. "We could obliviate him," she said, but didn't sound convinced. "Harry, memory charms can be broken. At the very least, someone would spot that he was missing 3 whole days' worth of memories. He attacked you, Hermione, you and Neville. He didn't succeed because you're both bloody scary with a wand, but he was casting lethal spells. If we let him go with a memory charm, he'll try again, and next time he might get lucky." "You can't just kill him in cold blood." "Well then, would you feel better if we made him hold a wand first?" George snarled. "He will be allowed to fight." "Give him back his wand." The memory hit Harry with the force of a bludger. "Bow to death, Harry." He clenched his hands and forced aside the whispered words and memory of a reborn Voldemort. It wasn't the same. One was the sadist's game of snake and prey. This was little better, maybe, but at least they were going to make sure that there was one less Death Eater out there roaming the streets. It's still murder. Then give us an alternative, Harry said softly. Because right now there isn't one. He's a murderer and a rapist, and if we let him go, he's not only never going to be convicted, but he'll probably do it again. Should we obliviate him back to childhood? Leave him in St. Mungo's like Lockhart and hope no one traces it back to us? Keep him locked up until he dies of old age, right here in these cells? Hermione's eye flickered to the bound man, then back to Harry, George all but forgotten for the moment. "You're not a murderer," she said softly. "I killed Voldemort," Harry corrected her. That was different. "How?" Harry sighed. "How is this anything more than finishing up what I started when Voldemort finally got put down for good?" Hermione stayed silent. Harry glanced at George again, then back at Hermione. "Dark Lord, remember," he said softly. "Why do you think I made that vow?" Hermione's hands were clenched so tight they were almost white, and her voice trembled faintly when she spoke. "I can stop you." Harry spread out his hands, wand resting on his palm. "You can," he agreed. "Say the word and I'll lay down my wand." Not that George would, and they both knew it. "He's a murderer and a rapist, a bigot of the worst kind, and a willing follower of Voldemort." Harry pressed on. "Tell me I've crossed the line and I will lay down my wand and leave him be." A moment passed, then two. "Go keep Ron company," George said quietly. "You don't have to see this." Hermione closed her eyes briefly. Then she took a shaky breath, straightened, and left the room. Like Ron, she didn't ask who cast the cutting curse, and like George, Harry didn't tell. We hope you enjoyed this chapter. Please consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon linked in the description, or become a member here on YouTube, where you will get access to several additional chapters weeks before they release on YouTube.